What if the most important truth about Meghan Markle was never said on camera, never leaked in a text, and never meant for the public to hear at all? What if it was whispered, quietly, privately, to the one person who knew her before the fame, before the titles, before Prince Harry ever entered the picture? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. According to Thomas Markle, that moment existed. And the sentence he claims his daughter said to him changes the entire story people think they know. She told me she'd leave Harry one day. Let that sit for a second. Not shouted, not emotional, not during a fight, but said calmly, as if it were already planned, as if it were a possibility she had already accepted, or worse, prepared for. So ask yourself this. Why would someone say that before a marriage had even settled into its first chapters? Why would someone speak about an ending while the world was still celebrating the beginning? This isn't just another family feud headline. This isn't just a bitter father talking to reporters. This matters now because it reframes everything. The interviews, the tears, the carefully chosen words, the pauses, the timing. If this statement is true, then the question isn't whether the marriage struggled later. The question is whether the exit was always part of the plan. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Thomas Markle didn't say this years ago. He didn't say it when the wedding happened. He didn't say it when public opinion was at its most volatile. He's saying it now, after silence, after distance, after watching the narrative solidify without him. Why now? That timing alone should make you pause. Because people don't break silence without a reason, especially not parents who know the cost of speaking out. Especially not fathers who have already been painted as unreliable, bitter, or irrelevant. So why step back into the fire? Maybe because there's something heavier than backlash. Maybe because watching a story repeat itself in public, while knowing a private truth, becomes unbearable. Think about it. If you were holding a piece of information that contradicted the fairy tale completely, how long could you stay quiet? And here's the part no one talks about. If Meghan said this to her father, what else did she say that never made it past those walls? What doubts were already forming while the cameras were still smiling? What calculations were already happening while the world believed it was all love and destiny? This isn't about taking sides. It's about asking the question no one wants to ask. Was the marriage built on forever or on timing? Because if Thomas Markle is telling the truth, then this wasn't a crack that formed later under pressure. This was a fault line that existed from the very start. And once you see that, the next pieces fall into place in ways that are impossible to ignore. This wasn't said to the press. It wasn't written down. And it certainly wasn't meant to become a headline. According to Thomas Markle, the sentence came quietly. No drama. No raised voice. Just a statement delivered with the kind of calm that's far more unsettling than anger. She told me she'd leave Harry one day. Think about that for a moment. People say a lot of things when they're emotional. They vent. They exaggerate. They lash out. But this wasn't framed as frustration. It wasn't framed as fear. It wasn't even framed as doubt. It was framed as a possibility already accepted. And that's what makes it chilling. Because when someone talks about leaving before the marriage has even weathered real storms, it forces a different question. Not what went wrong later, but what mindset existed at the beginning. Ask yourself this. Have you ever told someone you'd leave your partner one day if you were deeply, unquestionably invested? Or does that kind of language usually come from someone who already sees an exit door? Thomas Markle describes this moment not as a fight, but as a conversation. A matter-of-fact exchange. Almost strategic. Almost detached. That detail matters. Because detachment suggests distance. And distance suggests preparation. Here's where the contradictions start to pile up. At the same time this alleged conversation took place, the public narrative was pure fairy tale. Soulmates. Destiny. A love story breaking royal tradition. The press was filled with glowing descriptions of devotion and sacrifice. But behind closed doors, according to her own father, the language was different. So which version was real? And before anyone dismisses this as bitterness, pause. Thomas Markle gains nothing from framing his daughter as calculated rather than emotional. In fact, it makes him look worse. It invites backlash. It reinforces every negative label already attached to him. So why say it at all? That's the part people skip over. If this were about attention, there are easier stories to tell. If this were about revenge, there are harsher accusations to make. Instead, This claim sits in an uncomfortable middle ground. Not explosive enough to be theatrical, too specific to be random. And specificity is dangerous. Because once you accept the possibility that this sentence was real, everything else shifts slightly out of alignment. Interviews start to feel rehearsed. Emotional moments feel timed. Even silence begins to feel intentional. Was this a warning? A contingency plan? Or a glimpse into a mindset that always kept one foot outside the door? And here's the most unsettling question of all. If she was comfortable saying this to her father, who else heard versions of it? Friends? Advisors? People whose job it was to think 10 steps ahead. Because once a thought is spoken out loud, it usually didn't start there. And what came next would make that sentence feel less like a throwaway comment, and more like the first move in a pattern that only became visible much later. One comment can be dismissed. A pattern cannot. And this is where Thomas Markle's claim stops sounding like a single, isolated remark and starts feeling like a thread you can't unsee once you pull it. Because when you place that sentence beside what happened next, the timeline begins to feel off. Ask yourself this. If someone truly believes they've found their forever, do they speak in contingencies? Do they quietly prepare emotional escape routes while the world is still celebrating the beginning? Or does that kind of thinking usually belong to someone who sees relationships as phases rather than destinations? According to Thomas, that statement didn't exist in a vacuum. It aligned with behavior, with distance, with a noticeable shift in tone over time. Publicly, the message was unwavering devotion. Privately, there was something colder, more controlled, almost managerial. Short sentences, long pauses, conversations that felt less emotional and more transactional. And here's where the irony becomes impossible to ignore. At the same time she was speaking about leaving one day, the public was being told that this was the greatest love story of the modern royal era, that she had sacrificed everything, that she had given up her entire world for this relationship. But sacrifice doesn't usually come with a backup plan. Strategy does. Think about how often the narrative changed. One interview contradicted another. One explanation replaced the last. Details shifted, timelines blurred, emphasis moved depending on the audience. Was that growth? Or was it adjustment? People who live moment to moment don't constantly revise the past. People who are managing outcomes do. And here's the uncomfortable contradiction no one likes to sit with. If she truly felt trapped later on, why speak about leaving so early? Why plant the idea before the pressures reached their peak? Why articulate an ending before the struggle was visible? Unless the struggle wasn't the cause, but the justification. This is where Thomas Markle's words begin to carry a different weight. Not as an accusation, but as context. As a missing puzzle piece that suddenly explains why everything felt so carefully framed. Even the emotional moments. Especially the emotional moments. Tears appeared at the right times. Silence appeared when it was strategic. And when the story needed momentum, a new detail always emerged to move it forward. Ask yourself honestly, have you ever watched someone narrate their own life like a press release? Because that's what this starts to resemble. And then comes the question no one wants to touch. Did Harry know? Was he part of the planning or part of the positioning? Because if Thomas Markle is right, then one person in this story may have believed it was forever, while the other quietly accepted that it wasn't. And if that imbalance existed from the start, then the real fallout wasn't betrayal by the institution, it was something far more personal. But the most unsettling part isn't what was said. It's why Thomas waited this long to say it. Because the timing of this revelation suggests that something else happened behind the scenes, something that finally pushed him past the point of silence. And that next piece changes the meaning of everything you've heard so far. People don't break silence without a reason, especially not when staying quiet would be easier, safer, less painful. So when Thomas Markle finally spoke, the real question wasn't what he said. It was why he chose this moment to say it. Because by now, the damage to his reputation was already done. He had been dismissed, mocked, sidelined, and labeled unreliable. If his goal was sympathy, the window had closed long ago. If his goal was revenge, he waited far too long. Which means something else shifted. According to those close to the situation, Thomas didn't wake up one day craving attention. What changed was watching the story harden. Watching one version of events become history while the private conversations he remembered were erased completely. And that kind of erasure does something to a person. Imagine being a father who recognizes his daughter's voice in public interviews, but not her words. Imagine hearing certainty where you remember doubt. Permanence where you remember contingency. At some point, silence stops feeling like loyalty and starts feeling like complicity. That's the line Thomas seems to have crossed. And here's the emotional contradiction that makes this even messier. If he wanted to destroy her image, he could have said far worse. He could have framed her as manipulative, heartless, or cruel. Instead, he shared something quieter, more human, a sentence that doesn't scream villain, but whispers intention. That choice matters, because it suggests this wasn't about punishment. It was about correction, almost as if he wanted the record to reflect something closer to the truth, even if it made him look like the bad guy again, even if it guaranteed another wave of criticism. Ask yourself this. Would you willingly step back into public humiliation unless you felt something had gone too far? And what if the reason he spoke now wasn't about the past, but about the future? There's a subtle implication buried in his words that few people caught. When someone says, "She told me she'd leave Harry one day," it implies forethought, duration, a timeline that hasn't necessarily ended yet. What if Thomas isn't talking about something that already happened, but something he believes is still unfolding? That possibility changes the entire temperature of the story, because suddenly this isn't a reflection. It's a warning, and warnings don't come from bitterness. They come from fear, from regret, from realizing that staying silent earlier may have allowed something to grow unchecked. So now ask yourself the question that makes everyone uncomfortable. What does Thomas Markle know that hasn't been said yet? What conversations did he decide not to repeat? What details did he intentionally leave out? And what would have to happen for him to finally say the rest? Because if this sentence was the mild version, then the full story may not be ready for daylight. And the next piece doesn't just challenge the narrative. It threatens to expose who in this story was truly in control all along. So we're back where we started. One sentence, quietly spoken, never meant for the public, and yet powerful enough to reframe an entire story. She told me she'd leave Harry one day. At first, it sounds almost ordinary. People say things. Relationships are complicated. Doubt exists everywhere. But the more you sit with it, the heavier it becomes. Because this wasn't said after chaos. It wasn't said after exile, backlash, or breakdown. It was said early. And that timing is everything. When you circle back to the opening question, the story shifts. This no longer feels like a marriage that collapsed under pressure. It begins to resemble a relationship that carried an expiration date long before the world ever noticed the cracks. That doesn't mean everything was fake. Real emotions can exist alongside strategy. Affection can coexist with calculation. But once you accept that possibility, the fairy tale framing starts to wobble. Look back now at the interviews. The pauses. The carefully chosen words. The moments of vulnerability that arrived exactly when the narrative needed them most. Ask yourself honestly, as a viewer, not as a fan or critic, did it ever feel spontaneous? Or did it feel managed? Thomas Markle's revelation doesn't demand that you hate anyone. It doesn't even demand that you pick a side. What it demands is that you reconsider the story you were handed and ask who benefited from it being told that way. Because if one person entered the marriage believing in forever, and the other entered it accepting one day as a possibility, then the imbalance was built in from the start. And that imbalance has consequences. Not just for the relationship, but for everyone pulled into it. Family, institutions, even the public, who were invited to invest emotionally in a narrative that may have always been provisional. There's also something deeply human here that gets overlooked. Thomas Markle didn't present himself as a hero. He didn't emerge victorious. He spoke knowing he'd be attacked again, knowing he'd be doubted, knowing he'd be accused of bitterness. That alone should give you pause. Because people who are lying usually oversell. They dramatize. They escalate. What he offered instead was a single line and a lifetime of implication. And maybe that's why it's so unsettling. Because if this was the soft version, then harder truths may still be sitting in silence. Conversations left unrepeated. Warnings left unspoken. Details deliberately withheld. So here's the question you're left with. If this was said once, how many times was it thought? And if it was thought that early, how far ahead was the story really planned? You don't have to answer that now. In fact, you probably shouldn't. Because this story isn't finished. Not by a long shot. And the next revelation doesn't just explain the past. It forces a reckoning with what might still be coming.